She left her marriage for a better future, only to discover it was built on someone else's property. She chose her words carefully when she finally told her husband that she was no longer happy. She didn't present it as betrayal, and she didn't describe it as an escape. Instead, she framed it as a practical conclusion, something that had been forming quietly for years. She said she felt exhausted by constant saving, by compromises that never seemed to lead anywhere meaningful, by the sense that her life was permanently on hold while everyone else moved forward. She explained that she wanted stability, opportunity, and a future that didn't feel fragile. Then she told him there was someone else, someone who could provide those things without hesitation. Her voice was steady, her reasoning carefully constructed, almost persuasive. It sounded less like a confession and more like a decision already finalized. To her, it felt responsible, even mature, as if she were choosing progress over stagnation. Her husband listened without interrupting. He didn't raise his voice or question her motives. He didn't accuse her or ask for details. He simply absorbed what she said and accepted it. That response unsettled her more than anger would have. She had prepared herself for resistance, for guilt or pleading, but instead she was met with quiet resignation. He told her that if this was truly what she wanted, he wouldn't stand in her way. He believed that at least she was being honest now, even if that honesty came too late. The marriage ended quickly, without public conflict or dramatic collapse, leaving behind a silence that felt strangely unfinished. She moved on almost immediately. Within weeks, she packed her belongings and stepped into a life that felt lighter and more expansive. Her new partner was wealthy, confident, and comfortable speaking about money as if it were a tool rather than a limitation. He talked about the future with ease, about plans that didn't require calculation or restraint. He showed her places where prices weren't discussed and decisions were made casually, without concern for consequence. She felt chosen, elevated, as if she had finally aligned herself with the life she was always meant to live. She didn't hide her new lifestyle, but she didn't explain it either. Subtle images appeared, hints of comfort and luxury, moments that suggested success without openly announcing it. She assumed her former husband was no longer paying attention. In her mind, he belonged to a chapter already closed, a necessary step she had outgrown. What she didn't realize was that he noticed everything, not with longing or resentment, but with a clarity that came from finally seeing the entire picture without illusion. As she settled into her new world, her confidence deepened. The compromises she once resented were gone. She no longer hesitated before spending or planning. Everything felt smoother, as if effort itself had been removed from her life. She believed she had made the right choice, that leaving had been an act of courage rather than convenience. And with each passing day, she became more convinced that the future she wanted was already secured. Months passed, and her certainty only hardened. The new life she stepped into rewarded her immediately, reinforcing every justification she had offered when she walked away. There was no more mental arithmetic before purchases, no more discussions about whether something was necessary or could wait. Decisions were made quickly, confidently, with the assumption that resources would always be available. Her new husband spoke about money as something fluid and abundant, something that bent easily to intention. He never hesitated, never paused to calculate. To her, that ease felt like security itself. She began to see her past marriage a transitional phase rather than a failure, a period of necessary limitation that had prepared her for something better. When people asked about the change, she smiled and spoke about growth, about finally choosing herself. She framed the shift as evolution, not replacement. The more she repeated that story, the more convincing it became, even to her own ears. She believed she had outgrown a life that demanded patience and compromise, and that belief made everything else feel justified. The idea of marking her new beginning with a celebration came naturally. It wasn't a wedding, not something bound by tradition or expectation, but a gathering meant to symbolize arrival. She wanted to surround herself with people who understood ambition and admired momentum, people who saw success as proof of wisdom. The venue mattered because it had to reflect the narrative she was living. When her husband suggested the lakeside house, expansive and secluded, she accepted without hesitation. He told her it belonged to him, acquired years ago as part of his portfolio, and she took that as further confirmation that she had aligned herself with stability. The house was everything she imagined success should look like. Large windows framed the water, light moved effortlessly through the rooms, and the space carried an unmistakable sense of permanence. Standing there during preparations, she felt a quiet triumph. This was what she had wanted all along, not extravagance for its own sake, but the absence of limitation. The house became more than a location. It was a symbol, a physical validation of the decision she had made. Invitations went out quickly, and the responses confirmed her expectations. People were curious, impressed, eager to witness the transformation. Friends from her new circle spoke openly about how well everything suited her, how natural the transition seemed. She accepted their admiration easily, interpreting it as confirmation that she had chosen correctly. In her mind, the past was settled, neatly concluded. On the day of the celebration, she moved through the house with practiced confidence, overseeing details and greeting guests. Laughter filled the space, conversations overlapped, and the evening unfolded exactly as she had envisioned. She felt victorious, convinced that the life she once worried about losing had already been replaced by something stronger. What she didn't know was that far away, a single, unintentional conversation was unraveling the story she believed was complete. The celebration unfolded smoothly, every detail aligning with the image she had constructed so carefully over the past months. Guests admired the setting, commenting on the calm of the water outside and the effortless elegance of the house itself. She accepted their praise with practiced ease, moving through conversations as if this life had always belonged to her. In those moments, she felt untouchable, convinced that she had not only escaped limitation, but rewritten her story entirely. The house became a stage where her decisions appeared validated, where every smile and raised glass reinforced the idea that she had chosen wisely. What she could not see was how fragile that validation truly was. Far from the lakeside, her former husband was standing still, processing information that had arrived without intention or drama. It was a brief exchange, an offhand remark that carried more weight than anyone realized. One sentence landed incorrectly, followed by a pause on the other end of the call, just long enough to confirm what had not been meant to be revealed. In that silence, understanding settled in fully. He saw the shape of the narrative she was living, and more importantly, the gap in her knowledge that made it possible. He realized that, while she believed she had stepped into a world of certainty, she was standing on ground she did not understand. There was no surge of anger, no instinct to confront or correct. Instead, he felt a calm recognition that something had reached its natural conclusion. He understood that he had not simply been left behind, but used, his steadiness serving as a contrast that made her new life feel brighter by comparison. Yet even that realization did not provoke bitterness. It sharpened his focus. He knew exactly what she did not know, and that knowledge gave him clarity rather than power. The lakeside house had been his long before it ever became part of her story. Years earlier, when his finances allowed for long-term planning, he had purchased the property quietly as an investment. It was not a trophy or a statement, just a decision rooted in patience and foresight. He rarely visited it and never mentioned it, believing that wealth did not need to be displayed to have meaning. The documents were stored securely, unchanged, their validity unquestionable. The house existed independently of the life she now believed she was living. Back at the celebration, the evening reached its peak. Music filled the space, conversations blended together, and the atmosphere carried a sense of arrival. She looked around and felt certain that she had finally crossed the threshold into the future she deserved. The past, in her mind, had no remaining influence. The man she left behind had become irrelevant, a necessary step rather than a lingering presence. Then the shift occurred, quietly at first, a small interruption at the edge of the gathering, subtle enough to be dismissed as a logistical detail. Conversation slowed. Attention shifted. The arrival of authority was calm, professional, almost understated, but it carried immediate weight. Guests were informed that the property could not be used as planned. The request to leave was polite but firm, delivered without accusation or spectacle. Confusion spread through the room as people searched for explanations that did not exist. Her new husband reacted differently than she expected. Instead of challenging the situation or asserting control, he withdrew. He stepped away from the center of attention, made brief calls, and then disappeared entirely, leaving behind no reassurance and no defense. In his absence, the truth became unavoidable. The house was not his. The foundation of the celebration, the symbol of her success, did not belong to the life she believed she had entered. As guests filtered out, the reality settled in slowly, but decisively. The admiration that had filled the room moments earlier dissolved into awkward silence and unanswered questions. She stood alone in a space that no longer felt victorious, watching the illusion collapse without confrontation or explanation. The story she thought she controlled had shifted beyond her influence, and for the first time since she walked away from her marriage, she understood that the future she believed she had secured was built on assumptions she never thought to question. The aftermath settled in with a quiet intensity that felt heavier than any public confrontation could have. Once the guests were gone and the house emptied, she stood surrounded by stillness that no longer felt elegant or expansive. The rooms that had seemed to promise permanence now felt impersonal, almost indifferent. The celebration meant to mark her arrival into a better life had instead exposed how little of that life truly belonged to her. There were no raised voices, no accusations shouted across the space. The reckoning arrived through absence. Her new husband did not return her calls. Messages went unanswered. The confidence he once carried vanished as completely as he had, leaving behind only the realization that his assurances had never been anchored in responsibility. In the days that followed, pieces of the truth surfaced gradually. The house had been accessed under false authority, permissions assumed rather than granted. Every detail pointed back to the same conclusion. She had trusted promises without verifying their foundation. The life she believed she stepped into was not secured by ownership or foresight, but by performance. And once the performance failed, so did the protection it offered her. Meanwhile, her former husband did not reach out. He did not explain, demand, or confront. His silence was deliberate and final. Legal steps moved forward quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. The process did not require her involvement or consent. It existed independently of her reaction. The clarity of that fact unsettled her more deeply than anger ever could have. She realized then that while she believed she had outgrown him, he had simply chosen not to compete in the narrative she was telling. He had stepped aside, not because he was defeated, but because he understood the difference between visibility and control. As her new life unraveled, the old one resurfaced in sharp contrast. She remembered the stability she once dismissed as limitation, the careful planning she interpreted as restraint, the quiet consistency she mistook for stagnation. None of it had felt exciting, but all of it had been real. Now, surrounded by uncertainty, she saw how easily excitement had replaced substance in her decision-making. The compromises she resented had been grounded in shared reality, not illusion. The social circle that once celebrated her transformation grew distant. Invitations stopped. Conversations shortened. Admiration faded into polite detachment. Without the visible markers of success, interest dissolved quickly. She began to understand how conditional that world had always been. It had welcomed her not for who she was, but for what she represented. And once that representation fractured, so did her place within it. Alone, she revisited the moment she left her marriage, replaying her words and reasoning with new awareness. She had believed she was choosing progress, that pragmatism unjustified the damage left behind. But standing now in the consequences of that belief, she recognized how selectively she had defined honesty. She had told the truth in fragments, presenting her departure as rational while avoiding the deeper reality that she wanted more without knowing what it would cost. The future she envisioned no longer existed. What remained was uncertainty she had never prepared for, stripped of the confidence that once carried her forward, and as the weight of that realization settled in, she understood that the greatest loss was not material or social, but narrative. She no longer controlled how her story would be told, because it was no longer hers alone to shape. In the weeks that followed, she learned how quickly certainty dissolves once the story supporting it collapses. Without the house, without the man who promised stability, and without the admiration that once surrounded her, she was left confronting a version of herself she had carefully avoided. The life she imagined as permanent had been built on borrowed confidence and unverified assurances, and once those were removed, there was nothing left to shield her from consequence. She downsized quietly, moving into a space that felt provisional rather than triumphant, a place that reflected reality instead of aspiration. Each decision now required calculation again, the very thing she believed she had escaped. Her former husband remained absent, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to resolve. He had never sought vindication or recognition. He had simply allowed events to unfold according to facts rather than emotion. The investment property returned to its previous state, unused and undisturbed, as if the celebration had never happened. That absence of reaction became its own statement. She realized that, while she had been focused on appearances, he had been focused on structure. While she pursued momentum, he preserved foundations. The contrast between them could not have been clearer. As time passed, the narrative she once told herself became impossible to maintain. She could no longer describe her decision as noble or pragmatic without acknowledging what it had truly been, a gamble disguised as certainty. She had believed she was choosing a better future, but in reality, she had traded a stable life for a performance that depended entirely on someone else's credibility. When that credibility vanished, so did the future she thought was guaranteed. There were moments when she considered reaching out, not to ask for reconciliation, but to explain herself in ways she hadn't before. But she understood that explanations offered after consequence rarely serve their intended purpose. Whatever needed to be said had already been expressed through action, through the quiet unraveling of the life she built on assumption rather than truth. She accepted that some bridges collapse not because they are attacked, but because they were never supported properly to begin with. Gradually, she began rebuilding again, this time without illusions. The process was slower, humbler, and stripped of spectacle. She learned to evaluate promises, to question ease, to recognize the difference between abundance and reliability. The experience reshaped her understanding of security, teaching her that stability does not announce itself loudly, and that wealth without accountability offers no protection. In reflecting on everything she lost, she finally understood the nature of her greatest mistake. It was not simply that she betrayed her husband, though that betrayal set everything in motion. It was that she underestimated him, assuming that quiet acceptance meant weakness, that restraint meant lack of awareness. She failed to recognize that the person she left behind understood far more than she ever gave him credit for. By the time she reached that understanding, the outcome was already settled. The future she once celebrated had vanished, replaced by a life shaped by consequence rather than fantasy. And in that clarity, she recognized the final truth of her story. She had not lost everything because she chose more. She lost it because she chose without understanding what she already had.